Hey everybody, in today's tutorial I'm going to be making some drums from scratch in the style of Noisia. And here are some samples from their sample pack that I'm going to be using as a reference. That's a kick drum, and here's a phase plant patch to recreate the drum, or at least the vibe of it. And here's a snare from the Noisia sample pack. That's the kick again. Let me just grab this one. And here is a phase plant patch with that vibe of that snare. So Noisia are really talented audio engineers, and when I think of their music, I think of like really high fidelity, high quality audio, and you can tell from their Patreon videos, they're really cerebral, like they think about the process of crafting sounds a lot. So I probably can't recreate exactly what they did, and I'm not even using the same tools, but hopefully by kind of trying to model their sounds, I'll learn some concepts of what makes a really nice sample that can cut through the mix. And just to kind of demonstrate how they cut through the mix, here's a little rough demo featuring those phase plant patches. Cool, so to start things up, let's zoom in on the kick drum sample from Noisia, because pretty much just from the waveform alone, we can get everything we need to reverse engineer it. A couple other tools for reverse engineering are these metering tools I have at the top. I'm using mini meters, but any spectrogram, any spectrum analyzer, oscilloscope, all very useful tools. But yeah, just from this waveform, we can see the basics of the sound is we've got some fundamental pitch, like a sine wave, which is being clipped at the beginning for some amount of time, decays to zero. Overall, it's a pretty chunky sound. Like there's not a lot of dips in the sound. It's all pretty at a steady volume, and until the decay has a nice steady decay. And lastly, what really gives it the character is at the transient. First off, just like the way the pitch curves down from high frequencies to lower, but especially kind of at almost like a fractal level. Not only do you have this main fundamental going down, but you have these kind of upper frequencies. Maybe it might be harmonic, it might be inharmonic, but you kind of have this upper pitch sine wave. And what's really characteristic about this to me is that you really only notice these upper frequencies, let's just call it the harmonic. You only notice this harmonic during essentially like when the fundamental is transitioning between the peaks. Like you're not seeing a lot of frequency content or a lot of upper harmonic movement during the peaks. It's kind of clamped down, saturated, especially during these things you can see that. But during the zero crossings, you do see it. So we can try and model that with a couple tricks I'll show you. So I've already taken some notes and written down analyzing the amplitude and pitch envelopes, but I can show you pretty quick how I would do that is like looking at how using the time axis in Ableton, you can see about how long we're clipping and just kind of look at the time down there in milliseconds, how long the decay is, and then the pitch is kind of just experimentation, especially looking at this curve with the spectrum. You can kind of just tune the pitch curve until it looks like that shape, and that's really what you need. But just to really try and match the character, I even went in and kind of figured out exactly what the pitch envelope should look like to line up almost line up the phase of my fundamental with the Noisia sample. So let's start from scratch, and we will pull up a sine wave, we can dial in the amplitude envelope right away. So this gain will set to 0 dBs, attack can stay at 1, decay 125 milliseconds, sustain 0, and hold 45 milliseconds. Next, I'm going to add a second envelope, which pushes the level of the sine over 0 dB, which is when we'll be clipping. Actually, we can just throw the clipper in now so you see what I'm talking about. So we're going to set up this hard clip, no DC filter, no dynamics. Set the drive to 0 dB. So anytime this sine wave exceeds 0 dB, and in fact, we'll clip a little bit more of that. We'll set it to like 0.5. So we're clipping even a little more of the wave. And then we'll set up another envelope, which is just for a shorter amount of time going to push this level over 100% and clip the signal. So no attack, decay will be 12 milliseconds, and the hold will be 40 milliseconds. We'll set this to the level. It's 25%. And we can resample that really quick just to check our work. So one thing is we are going to want to pull this level down a little bit, maybe 6 dB. We can level match it later, but that's just a little hot. Yeah, so it looks like it's clipping for roughly the right amount of time if we dragged it over, compared it to the Noisia sample. It's roughly similar. But now we need to adjust the pitch. So first off, I have this fundamental tuned. I'll show you the MIDI now. It's tuned to a G0. But we will also have an envelope sweep the pitch down. So just to organize things, I'm going to create a pitch group called pitch envelope. And that's because I'm going to combine two envelopes to help me. That was easier for me to dial in the sound. So we'll have no attack, sustain 0. The decay will be 86 milliseconds, which is about half the waveform. So it lets our waveform kind of steady out or sustain at the end at the pitch. The shape is going to be 58%. Or sorry, this should be negative 58. No, yeah, positive 58. My apologies. That reminds me, I also need to change the shape of this amplitude envelope. So we will set this to be like, more like this type of shape. Yep. And then, yeah, this pitch envelope, we are going to set to the master pitch with 24 semitones. And then I'm going to set up a second pitch envelope that's even shorter. No attack on either of these. It's just going to have a 2.5 millisecond decay and a hold of 1 millisecond. And this is going to go... Got to fix the first one. This is going to go with 26 semitones. So now let's check our work by resampling it. And this should pretty much match the general shape of the Noisia sample. My levels are a little off still, but you can see the peaks of these waveforms are lining up pretty nicely. It's not exact, but you really don't need to get exact to get the character. And also, this is kind of more of it, teaching how to find this kind of sweet spot so you can adjust this to your taste. It's not like this Noisia sample has to be exactly recreated. Just trying to learn some concepts by recreating the sample. So next, let's work on this kind of transient detail at the beginning. I'm going to call it kind of like a harmonic, although it might be a little inharmonic. And so I'm going to show you how we can have this content only live or only have amplitude during the zero crossings of the original waveform. So we're going to do that with parallel distortion. And there's pretty much two ways to do it. There's another amplitude modulation method I can show you when we do the snare. But for this one, let's use the parallel distortion trick. So we will get another sine, bring this up to the 12th harmonic, and we will set up the amplitude envelope first, where this has very little, if any, attack. Let's say like 0.5 milliseconds. The decay, actually didn't write this down in my notes, but we'll say it's about 60 milliseconds, maybe a little less, like 45, 40, and sustain down. And then if we want this frequency content to only be near the zero crossings, so this part of the kind of the middle of our fundamental frequency, what we can do is bring a copy of this in. So you could just copy and paste the waveform, but this allows us to, if we use this aux, it allows us to make changes to the fundamental while keeping the same processing pipeline. So that this aux brings a copy of the fundamental into this voice or this chain. We'll bring this level all the way up because we're going to slam this into a distortion. And we'll choose a saturate with 4 dBs of saturation. And we'll even bring in a mix all the way up just to slam this even harder. And now this is going to squash the upper harmonic or the upper frequency when the sine wave is peaking, but keep that frequency content more or less unchanged during the zero crossing, especially if we bring this level down to or about there. And then we can filter out the fundamental from this chain, this kind of like parallel copy of it. So now you can see this waveform, it's just left with these kind of like copies of the upper harmonic that only exist near the zero crossings. And not only is this kind of just modeling what I saw in the waveform, but it's just kind of a cool trick because if we place the upper harmonics here, it's kind of keeping headroom. Like when our fundamental is peaking, that is kind of the max headroom our signal is going to be at. So if we kind of didn't kind of squash it here, we would be adding even more we'd be losing headroom by adding more like peak frequency there. So if we can squash this upper frequency out during those sections, we're left with more headroom. So kind of it's setting us up for a nicer mix later on. So I'm just going to add another little pitch envelope to this upper harmonic so it sweeps down just a little bit more. And then let's see what that looks like. Yeah, you can see, probably need to bring the level of that up a little bit, but you can see we're starting to get that little squiggly detail to match the Noisia sample. So if I just maybe drive this a little bit harder, bring the gain of this up, maybe even just bring this up to 0 dB and bring the drive back down. Now we're starting to sound more like it. And I think I'm still a little too loud. And if we loop this, we can just kind of get the levels right. Yeah, so that's the basic idea of this kick patch. And if you were to dial this in a little further, maybe even get a little more detail at the beginning of this waveform, you might even need to layer a sample because that might not be completely just like a harmonic, especially at this very beginning. Maybe just layer like a click in there. I think you could get even closer, but even for just this pretty rough, quick and dirty patch, it's already at least has the same vibe as that kick, and it should sound pretty good in the mix. Well, one other thing I can show is I have this alternative variation of the patch, which pretty much just layers this Foley sample in there. So this is where you can start to kind of like integrate the sound into your own process. And now that we've modeled the Noisia one, we kind of have the DNA, so we can start to kind of mutate it and make our own little twists on it. So here I have like a Foley sample layered in with the amplitude modulation trick. This is what I was talking about before, where we have this rectified version of the fundamental. It's a rectified sine, rectified and inverted with a DC offset. And pretty much when this waveform is high, when the other one is low, near zero, and this one is low where the other one is peaking. So it's pretty much going to let our amplitude through when the fundamental is at zero, when there's a lot of headroom, and when the fundamental is peaking, when there's no headroom, it's going to choke our amplitude of this sample. And it sounds like that. So together, the samples with it's kind of a variation, so our offbeat kick has a little variation. It sounds like this. Yeah, sounds good. Okay, so let's take a look at the snare drum next. And this is the Noisia sample. And it's going to be very simple, very similar to the kick drum in that there is going to be this fundamental frequency, this kind of like sine wave sweeping down from a high pitch down to a lower pitch. But the new additions is that we will have a noise source or some sort of inharmonic content, and that will last actually even longer than after the fundamental dies out. Here the fundamental is almost gone, but the noise persists. The transient also has quite a bit going on, and it even kind of deviates quite a bit from the fundamental over here. So I don't know if there was layered samples or if this was completely done with synthesis, but I will be layering in a couple samples to try and model that type of sound at the beginning more so. And I also mentioned I'm just going to use a noise source from the tail. They used something more complicated than just like white noise. They used either an acoustic snare sample or some other fancier method of generating inharmonics. So it won't exactly model it, but it does still kind of give the vibe. And I mean, I guess like really the main thing to take away from these Noisia snares is this nice, beautiful shape. Like they're so like steady, like this nice, the body has no weird dips in it. And I think that's because they really don't over process these things. Like if you put a ton of EQ on these samples, you're really going to be like dipping the amplitude on parts of these snares when you're when the sine wave is gliding through those parts of the frequencies. But you can tell they do so much of this with careful synthesis that you really just end up with these nice chunky waveforms that cut through the mix. And I guess that's maybe the main thing to take away, or at least that I took away from modeling their snares. So it's so similar to the kick. The setup is so similar. We don't need to model this from scratch. I will just disable the new stuff for right now and show you this is just the same type of like fundamental frequency right here. We've got an amplitude envelope. Instead of this amplitude envelope, I just have both of these are controlling the amplitude down here, where this is pushing us into the clipping region. And this is kind of the main body of the snare. I can show you the parameters really quick. No attack on the main body, 40 milliseconds decay, linear, like 7% shape, 0 sustain, hold at like 40 milliseconds. The clipping envelope has 5 millisecond attack, 5 millisecond decay, 0 sustain, and 30 millisecond hold. And sounds like this. In fact, if we loop it with the main sample alternating, you can see in the spectrogram that the kind of the energy already, the spectral energy is lining up close enough for our purposes. So yeah, I guess the other parameters I can mention is the pitch envelope. Not so much decay in this kind of longer pitch envelope. It's only almost 4 semitones. So whereas the kick was gliding down 24 semitones. This one is much less, with just 3-4 semitones over kind of the body of the snare, a more steady sustained pitch here, which you can also see in the shape. But there is quite a bit of like the transients really fast, but quite a bit of modulation up 37 semitones, with a decay of 3.4 milliseconds and a hold of like 1 millisecond. Okay, so the next thing we'll add is the noise source, and just looking at the waveform, you could kind of see that there was like a 25 millisecond attack before the noise really kicked in. I have like a 61 millisecond decay and a 30 millisecond hold. Shape is 100%, so pretty fast shape. Maybe that's a little too much. And this attack has a 50% shape. And the noise source, I've got all the way over to white noise. I've added some stereo spread. I'm also filtering it at about 1K. I'm boosting the frequency right around 1K. Probably could have just used the Q, but set it up this way. I've got running that filtered noise into a saturation with the drive turned up quite a bit to 20 dB and some more stereo spread. It sounds like this. So this would probably be about the time I went and visited the EQ. I wanted it even a little brighter. Just sweetens it up. And I'll also mention there's 2 stages of distortion in the snare, whereas the kick had just the clipper. This one I'm first driving into a first stage of clipping, which has the mix turned down. And I noticed that just because we're clipping a little bit less than the kick, it almost looks like soft clipping, which I didn't have that type of distortion in my arsenal. And I'm probably even clipping too much still. But the Noisia waveform is clipping, you can see, but it's not as much. So we've got the clipper set up, we've got the noise, we've got the EQ. And from here, it was just kind of trying to model more of what's going on in the transient. So I've got another one of those upper harmonics. Like I mentioned before, this is another way of kind of squishing down the waveform when you're at the zero crossings of the fundamental. So we've got amplitude modulation, just kind of a nice mixing trick. Still gives us some of that information. This one is subtle because I ended up layering a sample to handle more of the transient, but if you turn it up, it'll give us kind of a nice click. And this would be a nice technique as well. In fact, I could probably just disable it. I had it turned down so much. But just I think that they were not doing something as simple as this. They either layered a sample or did something a little more fancy. So I ended up just layering a click sample. This is a Foley sample of just a stick clicking. And then also layering in a acoustic sample of an acoustic snare just to get some of those overtones. And there's 26 milliseconds of attack. So we're kind of cutting off the transient. We're filtering out the body. We really just want some of those overtones to not just have kind of white noise in the tail. So that can actually be quite powerful. And I think probably if you had a couple more snare samples and really dug deep, you could probably match their sound a lot closer if you spent some more time on choosing the right snare sample. But this one sounds good to me. Yeah, so the last thing, I don't think they had any reverb, but just to my taste, I liked putting this in, or at least experimenting with putting this in a live room with a convolver. It just makes it sound a little more realistic, depending on your taste. And yeah, the only other thing I'll mention about the snare is it's pretty cool when you're making your own ones. It's easy to make these variations. Yeah, this ghost snare, it's just a copy of the previous snare, but just adjust the envelopes a little bit, adjust the level, and I deleted some of the samples since it's kind of a simplified, stripped down version, and I did include the room reverb on the ghost snare. And that's just, yeah, we kind of have a variation on the snare sample to get a drum loop that sounds something like this. Sweet. Yeah, so that's all the drum sounds I wanted to show you. I love drum sound synthesis. It's one of my favorite sound design projects I've been working on recently. So a lot to learn from Noisia. They're definitely masters of that craft. And I hope you learned some useful tricks. If you did, remember to give this video a like. And if you want to see more content like this, subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.